Anne Neville was born on June 11, 1456, into one of the most powerful and noble families of England, the Nevilles. Her father, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the country, often known as Warwick the Kingmaker for his pivotal role in the Wars of the Roses. The Nevilles held extensive lands and titles, and through both birth and marriage, they were closely related to the English throne. Anne's mother, Anne Beauchamp, Countess of Warwick, was also from a noble lineage, further solidifying Anne's high standing in English society. Anne was the second of two daughters, with her older sister Isabel being born a few years earlier. Because their parents had no sons, both Anne and Isabel were designated co-heiresses to the vast Warwick fortune. In the 15th century, this was a significant position, as women rarely inherited property and wealth unless there were no male heirs. Although her parents likely loved their daughters, the absence of a son would have been a disappointment for them. Sons were typically expected to carry on the family name, legacy, and titles, whereas daughters who inherited wealth would often pass it on to their husbands, potentially ending the family's direct influence. Anne's early life was one of privilege and luxury. The Neville family's wealth allowed for an opulent lifestyle, and Anne would have been raised with all the comforts of a noble household. Her father held numerous prestigious titles, including Captain of Calais and Chief Steward of various duchies and castles, which further enhanced their status. While Anne was born at Warwick Castle, she likely spent much of her early childhood in Calais, where her father served as captain. This period would have shaped her education and upbringing, with English as her primary language, but possibly learning French, which was considered an essential skill for noble women of the time. As Anne grew up, her family's political connections put her at the center of one of the most tumultuous periods in English history, the Wars of the Roses. Her father's shifting allegiances between the Lancastrians and Yorkists would have influenced Anne's understanding of power, loyalty, and the precariousness of noble life. From a young age, she was prepared for the strategic marriages that would define her future and the fortunes of her family. Despite her noble birth and her family's immense power, Anne's life would be marked by political instability and personal tragedy, a reflection of the volatile times in which she lived. Anne Neville's family background and upbringing positioned her as a key figure in the political landscape of 15th century England. She and her elder sister, Isabel, were the only children of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and Anne Beauchamp. As co-heiresses, they were poised to inherit their family's vast estates and wealth, which made them attractive prospects for political marriages that could influence the balance of power during the Wars of the Roses. While Anne's mother, Anne Beauchamp, gave birth to Isabel at the age of 25, she struggled with fertility and did not have and until nearly 5 years later, when she was close to 30. This struggle with childbearing seemed to continue in Anne's own life as well, as she would later have difficulty conceiving and ultimately bore only one son, who died young. Despite these challenges, Anne's childhood was one of comfort and privilege, surrounded by luxury thanks to her father's immense wealth, accumulated through inheritances and his many official roles. By the early 1460s, Richard Neville had become the wealthiest nobleman in England, with numerous titles and responsibilities, including the captaincy of Calais and stewardship over many duchies and castles. His position gave him control over the largest standing army in England, solidifying the Nevilles' influence within the country. Though Anne was born at Warwick Castle, it is likely that she spent a significant part of her early childhood in Calais, where her father held his most important military and political role. Anne's education and upbringing reflected her status as a noblewoman. She was probably fluent in both English and French, the latter being a valuable accomplishment for a woman of her rank. She would have been taught to read and write, as well as to ride a horse and attend religious services regularly. Her childhood was spent in the company of other noble children, including her future husband, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later King Richard III, who was raised as her father's ward alongside Anne and her sister. Despite the comforts and security of her early years, Anne's life would soon be shaped by the political ambitions and shifting allegiances of her father, known as the Kingmaker. His actions and alliances would lead and into a series of dramatic events, including 2 politically significant marriages and her eventual rise to the title of Queen of England. The Wars of the Roses, a series of civil wars between the rival houses of Lancaster and York, significantly influenced Anne Neville's life. These wars began in 1455, before Anne was born, and their impact would shape her future. At the time of Anne's birth, Henry VI was the King of England, but he suffered from a mysterious illness that left him unable to rule. In his absence, Richard, Duke of York, took control of the kingdom as protector, a position he held despite opposition from Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry's wife. Anne's father, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, became a key ally of the Duke of York, and his position as captain of Calais granted him control over the largest standing army in England. This alliance would thrust Anne's family deep into the political turmoil of the Wars of the Roses. Warwick played a crucial role in the Yorkist victory at the Battle of St. Albans in 1455, solidifying his importance within the royal court. As a result, Anne and her family moved between their estates in England and Calais, where Warwick had established alliances with powerful figures such as Charles VII of France and Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. The conflict between the Lancastrians and Yorkists escalated, with Anne's father continuing to support the Yorkist cause. By 1460, Warwick and his allies captured King Henry VI, and Richard, Duke of York, declared himself the rightful king. However, York was killed before he could claim the throne, and it was his eldest son, Edward, who succeeded in becoming King Edward IV in 1461. This shift in power directly affected Anne's future, as she grew up in a world where political allegiances determined the fate of noble families. During her childhood, Anne likely spent time in the company of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III, who was raised as a ward in her father's household alongside her sister Isabel and Frances Lovell. They were taught the skills necessary for noble children, including literacy in English and Latin, horseback riding, and religious observance. Anne and Richard, in particular, formed a close bond, which would eventually lead to their marriage. Despite the turbulent political climate, Anne's early years were filled with wealth, education, and the privileges that came with being part of the powerful Neville family. However, the ever-changing landscape of the Wars of the Roses meant that her life would soon take dramatic turns, leading to her eventual role as both a princess and a queen of England, intertwined with the shifting fortunes of the Yorkist and Lancastrian factions. And Neville's early life was greatly influenced by her father, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, often referred to as the Kingmaker, due to his pivotal role in shaping the political landscape of 15th century England. Warwick's ambition and political maneuvers significantly impacted Anne's future, as his alliances and conflicts dictated the course of her life. Warwick was a powerful figure, initially supporting the Yorkist cause in the Wars of the Roses. His influence helped Edward IV rise to the throne, cementing his reputation as a kingmaker. However, this alliance did not last, and Warwick's relationship with Edward began to deteriorate. The conflict between the two men arose partly because Edward chose to marry Elizabeth Woodville, a woman from a relatively minor noble family, without Warwick's consent. Warwick had expected to play a central role in arranging Edward's marriage to a foreign princess, a move that would have bolstered his own political power. Edward's defiance of Warwick's plans marked the beginning of a rift between the two. As a result, Warwick shifted his allegiance to the Lancastrian cause, forming an alliance with Queen Margaret of Anjou, wife of the deposed King Henry VI. This drastic change of loyalty had significant consequences for Anne, as Warwick arranged for her to marry Edward of Westminster, the son and heir of Henry VI, in 1470. The marriage was a political move designed to solidify Warwick's new alliance with the Lancastrians. Anne, who was only 14 at the time, became a pawn in her father's political game, caught between the shifting tides of the Wars of the Roses. Despite the grand ambitions behind her marriage, Anne's union with Edward of Westminster was short-lived. In 1471, the Lancastrians suffered a decisive defeat at the Battle of Tewkesbury, where Edward of Westminster was killed, and, now a widow at the age of 15, was left in a vulnerable position. Her father had died a few months earlier in battle, leaving her without his protection or influence. The sudden collapse of the Lancastrian cause and the deaths of both her husband and father left Anne's future uncertain. Anne's early life, shaped by her father's political ambitions and the tumultuous events of the Wars of the Roses, set the stage for her eventual rise to queenship, though not without personal tragedy and hardship along the way. After the death of her first husband, Edward of Westminster, and the collapse of the Lancastrian cause, and Neville's future seemed uncertain. The young widow, just 15 years old, found herself in a precarious position, with little support or influence. The sudden loss of her father, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, compounded her vulnerability, leaving her without protection in the dangerous political landscape of 15th century England. Following the decisive Yorkist victory at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, Anne was taken into the custody of Edward Ivy's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. There are differing accounts of how Anne ended up in Richard's care. Some suggest that she was held by George, Duke of Clarence, Richard's older brother and the husband of Anne's sister, Isabel, who may have sought control of Anne's inheritance. Others argue that Richard actively sought Anne's hand in marriage, motivated by personal feelings or a desire to secure her portion of the Warwick estates, which had been divided between her and Isabel. Regardless of the circumstances, Anne's marriage to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, marked a turning point in her life. The two were married in 1472, and Anne became the Duchess of Gloucester. Richard's position within the Yorkist court provided Anne with a measure of security, though it was a stark contrast to her earlier marriage to Edward of Westminster, which had been arranged to support the Lancastrian cause. With Richard, Anne's life took on a more stable, if still politically charged, trajectory. Richard and Anne's marriage is often portrayed as one of mutual respect, if not deep affection. Unlike many political marriages of the time, there seemed to have some personal bond, although the extent of their emotional connection is debated by historians. They had one son, Edward of Middleham, born around 1473, who became the center of their family life. However, tragedy struck when their young son died in 1484, an event that devastated both Anne and Richard. Anne's position rose significantly in 1483 when Richard became King of England, following the controversial deposition of his nephew, Edward V. As queen, Anne played a more visible role in the royal court, though her reign was brief. Her health began to deteriorate in 1484, and she died in March 1485, likely from tuberculosis. At the time of her death, Anne was only 28 years old, and her passing left Richard without an heir, compounding the challenges he faced as his reign came under increasing pressure from rivals, particularly Henry Tudor. And Neville's life, shaped by political machinations and personal tragedy, illustrates the precarious nature of power and position for women in medieval England. And Neville's brief tenure as Queen of England was marked by both personal tragedy and political turbulence. Her ascension to the throne came in 1483, when her husband, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, took the crown as King Richard III after the mysterious disappearance of his nephews, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, the sons of Edward IV. This move sparked controversy and set the stage for a fraught period in English history. As queen, Anne Neville played a supportive role to her husband, though she was not heavily involved in political affairs. Unlike some of her predecessors, who were active in the machinations of court and maintained a quieter presence, largely focused on her family and her role as the king's consort. She had spent much of her life in the shadow of the powerful men around her, first her father, the Earl of Warwick, then her husbands Edward of Westminster and Richard. Despite this, she fulfilled her duties with dignity and grace during her short time as queen. One of the most devastating events of Anne's life occurred just a year into Richard's reign, the death of their only child, Edward of Middleham, in 1484. Edward, their son, had been their sole heir and the center of their world. His sudden death, at around 10 years old, was a catastrophic blow to both Anne and Richard. The loss of their son not only shattered them emotionally, but also created a political dilemma. Without an heir, Richard's position as king became even more precarious, as his rivals, particularly Henry Tudor, were quick to capitalize on the uncertainty surrounding the Yorkist succession. Anne's health began to decline following Edward's death, and she never fully recovered from the grief. In her final months, she became increasingly frail, with many speculating that she suffered from tuberculosis or another wasting illness, and passed away in March 1485 at just 28 years old. Her death left Richard isolated, both personally and politically. Just a few months later, Richard III would face defeat at the Battle of Bosworth, where Henry Tudor emerged victorious, bringing an end to the Wars of the Roses and the reign of the Plantagenet kings. And Neville's life as queen was tragically short, defined by loss and overshadowed by the political turbulence of the time. Her quiet strength, however, remains a testament to her endurance through some of the most difficult challenges a woman of her era could face. And Neville's life was marked by the challenges of loyalty and survival during one of the most violent and chaotic periods in English history, the Wars of the Roses. Born into the powerful and influential Neville family, Anne's early years were dominated by her father, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who was known as the Kingmaker for his pivotal role in the political struggles between the houses of York and Lancaster. From a young age, Anne was a pawn in the political ambitions of her father, who sought to manipulate alliances to his advantage. Anne's first marriage to Edward of Westminster, the son of the Lancastrian Queen Margaret of Anjou, was a direct result of her father's shifting political loyalties. Warwick had initially supported the Yorkists and helped Edward IV claim the throne, but later he turned against Edward IV and allied with the Lancastrians. This marriage placed Anne at the heart of the Lancastrian cause, but it also exposed her to the brutal consequences of war. Her husband, Edward of Westminster, was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, leaving Anne widowed at just 15 years old. In the aftermath of the battle, Anne was taken into the custody of her sister Isabel and her husband, George, Duke of Clarence, a situation that left her vulnerable and in a precarious position. Anne's fortunes changed dramatically when she married Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who would later become King Richard III. Richard was the brother of Edward IV, and Anne's marriage to him reconnected her to the Yorkist cause. Despite the political nature of their union, contemporary sources suggest that Anne and Richard had a genuine affection for one another. Together, they had one son, Edward of Middleham, who became the center of their lives. As Richard's wife, Anne played a supportive but largely quiet role. She was not a political figure in her own right, and her influence was primarily exercised through her position as Richard's consort. However, Anne's life was once again thrown into turmoil when their son, Edward, died in 1484 at the age of 10. The loss of their only child was devastating, both personally and politically, for the couple. It left Richard without an heir, further weakening his already tenuous hold on the throne. And Neville's life was one of constant upheaval, marked by the shifting allegiances and brutal realities of the Wars of the Roses. Her ability to navigate these challenges, surviving multiple political reversals and personal losses, speaks to her resilience. Although her time as queen was brief, Anne's legacy is tied to the turbulent events that shaped the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the rise of the Tudors.